She mocked him with a promise she never meant to keep. "Fix this ship and I'll marry you." But when he actually brought her starship roaring back to life, the entire base was forced to face a new reality. Most stories about aliens start with a military briefing, a news broadcast, or a flicker of strange lights in the sky. But this one, it begins with a grease-stained mechanic from Houston who never thought his name would be spoken inside a top-secret hangar in the middle of Nevada. His name was Ethan Rourke, 34 years old, with calloused hands and a mind wired for machines. And on a scorching afternoon, he found himself staring at a ship that should not have existed, sleek, cracked, and alive with technology centuries beyond human reach. "Mr. Rourke," one of the officials said, his voice clipped, "you're our last option." Ethan squinted at the massive structure, the hangar lights bouncing off its curved plating. "That's not an engine," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "That's a puzzle." The officials shifted uncomfortably, but their discomfort was nothing compared to the silence that followed. From behind the security detail stepped a tall figure draped in metallic fabrics that shimmered as though woven from liquid silver. Her eyes were sharp, almost too sharp, and her presence carried the kind of weight that made grown men look away. This was Queen Celera, leader of the alien delegation that had landed weeks earlier under the tightest cloak of secrecy the government could manage. She studied Ethan like one might study a curious insect. Then, with a smirk that cut through the tension, she said in accented but perfectly clear English, "Fix this starship and I'll marry you." Laughter erupted from a few of the military men. One scientist choked on his coffee. Ethan, however, didn't laugh. He simply looked at her, grease still smeared across his cheek, and replied, "Lady, I don't know if that's a threat or a promise, but I'll take the job." The air tightened. Celera raised one perfectly arched brow. "You're serious?" Ethan shrugged. "Engines are engines. They all tell you what's wrong if you're willing to listen. Doesn't matter if they run on diesel, plasma, or whatever this thing is." He gestured toward the broken vessel. The officials exchanged nervous glances. A civilian mechanic speaking with such confidence in front of royalty, alien royalty no less, wasn't part of the plan. But Celera seemed entertained. She tilted her head, her silver garments rippling as though alive. "You speak boldly for one so ordinary," she said. Ethan chuckled. "Where I come from, if you can fix something no one else can, ordinary doesn't stick too well." There was something in his tone, half humor, half challenge, that made her pause. For years, Celera had commanded armies, navigated galaxies, and bent entire systems to her will. Yet here stood a human who wasn't afraid to lock eyes with her. She dismissed him with a wave, but her smirk lingered. Hours later, Ethan was escorted through layers of security into the hangar where the starship rested. It loomed over him, towering like a cathedral of foreign metal. He could feel the heat radiating from its fractured core. Sparks sputtered from exposed wiring that didn't look like wiring at all, more like veins of glowing crystal. A guard muttered, "You really think you can fix that?" Ethan grinned without turning. "If I can't, no one can." He climbed onto the scaffolding, pulling out his battered toolbox. It looked out of place against the backdrop of alien technology, but Ethan had always believed tools were an extension of the mind, not just the hands. He ran his palm across the starship's outer plating and whispered, "All right, let's figure you out." From the observation deck above, Queen Celera watched. Her expression betrayed nothing, but her eyes followed every movement. To her, this mechanic was a curiosity, an unlikely piece in a much larger game. She had thrown the challenge as a jest, a way to mock the desperation of human officials. But now, as she saw Ethan's steady hands and unshakable focus, a sliver of curiosity pierced her skepticism. Ethan felt it too, that invisible weight of being watched. He glanced upward, meeting her gaze across the distance. For a moment, the hangar seemed to quiet, every sound dulled except the faint crackle of broken systems. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something sharper. recognition. And while most of the officials dismissed Ethan as a placeholder until the government found a real solution, Zalira knew something they didn't. The ship responded faintly to his touch, a flicker of light here, a pulse there, as if acknowledging his presence. He looked back at the control panel, tools clinking softly, and muttered under his breath, "Guess we're gonna get along after all." The story of Ethan Rourke and Queen Zalira had begun, not with love, not even with respect, but with a dare that no one took seriously. But what starts as mockery has a way of growing teeth when pride and possibility collide. The joke spread fast through the facility. By the next morning, every guard, scientist, and technician had heard about the Queen's marriage proposal to the human mechanic. Some laughed openly when Ethan walked past with his battered toolbox. Others just whispered, smirking behind clipboards. To Ethan, it was nothing new. He'd spent his life being underestimated. At 17, he rebuilt his uncle's rusted-out tractor when every mechanic in his county said it was done for. At 24, he kept an offshore drilling platform running through a hurricane by welding pipes in winds that could knock a man down. People called him stubborn, reckless, even crazy. But when the machines roared back to life, no one argued with the results. Still, this was different. This wasn't a busted pump or a corroded piston. This was alien technology, and not just alien, royal. The stakes weren't measured in money or pride, but in global security and interplanetary diplomacy. He was hunched over the starship's exposed systems when Colonel Harris, the head of the operation, approached. Harris was a square-jawed man with the patience of a bulldog, and his voice carried like gravel sliding across metal. "Rourke," Harris barked, "do you have any idea what you've gotten yourself into?" Ethan didn't look up. He had a wrench in one hand, a piece of alien conduit in the other. Yeah, a headache the size of Texas. "This isn't a game," Harris pressed, stepping closer. "You embarrass us in front of her. You make the entire country look weak." Ethan finally looked up, his eyes steady. "Colonel, you dragged me out here because all your PhDs couldn't make this thing hum again. You want results, not appearances. Let me do my job." From the observation deck, Zalira leaned on the railing, her metallic robes catching the hangar lights. She could hear every word. Her lips curved into that same mocking smirk. "You argue like a soldier," she called down, "yet you smell like oil and sweat." Interesting mix, Ethan shot her a look, one corner of his mouth twitching. Better than smelling like arrogance. The guard stiffened. Harris looked like he'd swallowed a stone. Talking to the Queen like that was unthinkable. But Zalira only tilted her head, amused. "You humans mistake arrogance for truth too often," she said. "This vessel cannot be fixed by mortal hands. You are a child trying to rearrange stars." Ethan tightened a bolt, sparks flickering around his glove. Maybe. But stars are just fire and gas, aren't they? Nothing a little ignition and balance can't handle. Her smirk faltered, just a flicker. She hadn't expected defiance, much less defiance that made sense. Later that night, Ethan sat alone in the hangar with the ship's gutted panels spread around him. The officials had gone to their quarters, the guards rotated to night shifts, and silence hung heavy except for the crackle of broken circuits. He leaned back on a metal stool, rubbing his temples. "Fix this starship and I'll marry you," he muttered, shaking his head. "What kind of royal says something like that?" "An honest one," came a voice behind him. Ethan jumped, nearly dropping his wrench. Queen Zalira stood in the shadows, her silver garments dimmed under the low lights. Without her guards, she looked less like a sovereign and more like a woman curious about the world she'd landed in. "You don't sleep?" Ethan asked. "Sleep is a luxury for the conquered," she said softly, stepping closer. "This ship was my people's heart. Without it, we are stranded. Do you understand what that means?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Means you need me more than you want to admit." Her eyes narrowed, but there was no venom in them. "You speak like you hold power, yet you are small, fragile, temporary." He smirked. "Machines don't care if you're fragile." They care if you're listening, and right now, this ship's whispering, you just can't hear it." She studied him in silence. The tension wasn't hostile anymore. It was something else, a grudging recognition. Finally, she said, "Perhaps your kind thrives on audacity." "Very well. Prove me wrong." Ethan picked up his wrench again. "Already planning on it." As she turned to leave, she paused. "And, Rourke, if you fail, the joke will be mine forever." When the hangar door shut behind her, Ethan exhaled, his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't sure if he was being tested, mocked, or invited into something bigger than he could imagine. But quitting wasn't in his vocabulary. But the line between a joke and a challenge can blur fast, especially when pride and desperation collide. By the third day, Ethan's fingernails were permanently stained with grime and his toolbox looked like it had survived a war. He had already burned through half a dozen pairs of gloves, each melted at the fingertips from making contact with the ship's strange conduits. The engineers from M1T and Caltech, who had been dismissed earlier, still lingered around the facility, shaking their heads when they saw him crawl out from under the hull. To them, he was just buying time before the inevitable failure. Ethan ignored the chatter. He had always worked better when people doubted him. Machines didn't care about gossip. They cared about pressure, torque, and timing. And this ship, no matter how alien, had patterns. He could feel them under his fingertips, the way a mechanic can hear when an engine is slightly off-key. "Rourke," Colonel Harris said one afternoon, striding across the hangar with his usual impatience. "You're 3 days in and haven't produced a single measurable result. The Queen thinks this is a circus act." Ethan tightened a connection, sparks jumping across the panel. "Tell the Queen to stop watching then." "She won't," Harris muttered. Of course she wouldn't. Queen Zalira had been at nearly every work session, sometimes standing high above on the balcony, sometimes leaning against the bulkhead with her arms crossed, her silver robes brushing the concrete floor. She never offered advice, but she always had that faint smirk, like she was waiting for him to trip and fall on his face. Late that night, Ethan lay on his back beneath the propulsion chamber, flashlight clamped between his teeth. He traced a cluster of crystal-like conduits with his gloved hand, muttering to himself, "You're not broken. You're blocked, like a clogged artery." "You talk to machines as though they are alive," a voice said. Ethan nearly banged his head against the panel. Zalira was there again, quiet as a shadow. "Everything's alive if you pay attention," he grumbled. "Engines, pipes, even busted wiring, they tell you stories. Most people just don't listen." She crouched near him, her eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. "And what does this ship tell you?" He set the tool down, rolling onto his side to face her. "It's angry. Feels like someone forced it into doing something it wasn't built to do." For the first time, her smirk faded into something more serious. That is not far from the truth. Ethan sat up, wiping grease across his cheek. "Care to explain?" "Careful, mechanic," she replied, her voice low. "You tread on matters beyond your clearance." He held her gaze. "Clearance doesn't fix engines. Understanding does." The silence stretched. Then, to his surprise, she spoke. "Our propulsion cores are not machines in your sense. They are bonded with living matrices. When they are wounded, they do not simply break. They resist repair. Like an injured animal," Ethan blinked. That explained why the wiring looked organic, why the circuits pulsed like veins. "So you're saying I'm not fixing an engine. I'm healing it." Zalira inclined her head slightly. "If you prefer that word." He leaned back, running a hand through his messy hair. "Well, I've patched up more than engines. Once fixed a horse's leg with duct tape and splints. Held long enough to get her running again." Her brows furrowed. "You compare my ship to livestock?" Ethan grinned. "I compare everything to what I know. That's the only way I can work." She didn't answer. But when she turned to leave, he caught the faintest trace of amusement on her lips. The next day, Ethan tried a different approach. He stopped forcing connections and started adjusting them gently, coaxing the ship to respond rather than commanding it. Hours passed with no results, but late in the evening, a faint ripple of light traveled through the conduits. The technicians monitoring the system gasped. "It responded," one whispered. Ethan smiled to himself. "Told you it was blocked." Colonel Harris stormed down the stairs, pointing a finger at him. "One flicker doesn't mean success." "Maybe not," Ethan replied, "but it means we're finally talking the same language." Above, Zalira's expression had changed. The smirk was still there, but it was tempered by something else. Curiosity, maybe, or grudging respect. That night, Ethan collapsed onto a cot in the corner of the hangar, too exhausted to make it back to his quarters. His hands ached, his muscles screamed, but he felt something he hadn't in days: momentum. He was onto something, and he knew it. But momentum only carries you so far before the real obstacles appear, and Ethan was about to find out how steep the climb truly was. By the end of the first week, Ethan's progress was undeniable. The ship pulsed with weak but consistent energy, and several dormant systems flickered back online. It wasn't enough to launch, but it was enough to quiet some of the scientists who had mocked him. Still, not everyone was impressed. During one tense meeting in the facility's conference room, Ethan sat at the long steel table surrounded by military brass, government advisors, and alien dignitaries. He was the only one in a stained jumpsuit while everyone else wore uniforms or regal robes. A scientist with thinning hair and a condescending tone leaned forward. "Rourke, you're tinkering blindly. We need a structured analysis, not cowboy improvisation." Ethan tapped his pen against the table, unimpressed. "You had your structured analysis for 2 weeks, got you nowhere." The man bristled. "This is not how proper engineering works." Before Ethan could respond, Zalira raised her hand. The room fell silent. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "proper engineering is the problem. You humans build machines to obey. Our vessels are not slaves. They require dialogue, not orders." Ethan glanced at her, surprised to hear her defending him. "Couldn't have said it better." The scientist scoffed, but Harris cut him off. "Enough! Rourke, get back to the hangar. The rest of you, let the man work." Later that evening, Ethan was back under the ship when Zalira approached again, her steps echoing on the hangar floor. This time, though, she wasn't smirking. She carried a small, glowing crystal that pulsed faintly in her hand. "This," she said, holding it out, "is a core fragment. It belongs to the vessel, but it was removed before your people brought it here. Without it, full restoration is impossible." Ethan frowned, taking it carefully. It was warm, almost alive in his palm. "Why are you giving me this now?" "Because I wanted to see if you could earn it," she replied. He chuckled. "So I've been working with half the parts missing?" "Call it a test," she said. "One you passed." He slid the crystal into his pocket. "You've got a strange way of testing people." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You speak as though you understand my ways. Yet your culture baffles me. You work for nothing but pride. You risk failure with no fear of shame. Why?" Ethan leaned against the hull, wiping sweat from his brow. "Where I'm from, you either stand by your word or you don't bother speaking. You mocked me, I took it seriously. Now I'm here doing what no one else could." She tilted her head. "And if you fail, then I fail trying. Simple as that." For the first time, she didn't argue. Instead, she studied him, her gaze softer than before. Perhaps audacity is not weakness. Perhaps it is strength in disguise. The conversation might have ended there, but the cultural divide soon cut through again. That same night, as Ethan worked, 2 alien engineers approached him. Their skin shimmered faintly in the hangar light, and their voices carried a musical tone. "You should not touch the conduit so freely," one said sharply. "It is sacrilege." Ethan set down his wrench. "With all due respect, your queen told me to fix this thing. If I can't touch it, it stays broken." The second engineer hissed, their luminous eyes narrowing. You profane what you do not understand." Before Ethan could snap back, Zalara intervened, her voice cutting through the tension. "Leave him. He works at my command." The engineers bowed reluctantly and withdrew, but not before shooting Ethan a glare that could have cut steel. Ethan exhaled. "Wait. Now I've got your people mad at me too." Zalara folded her arms. "Respect is not given lightly among my kind. You will either earn it or force it." "Story of my life," Ethan muttered, grabbing his wrench again. That night, as the ship flickered with new energy, Ethan realized something important. Fixing the vessel wasn't just about engineering, it was about navigating two cultures, two ways of thinking, both suspicious of each other. And somehow, he had become the bridge neither side expected. But bridges carry weight from both directions, and soon the strain would threaten to break more than just metal. The 8th day started like the others. Ethan on his back, flashlight clamped between his teeth, hands buried in the guts of the propulsion system. But unlike the other days, this time the ship responded with more than flickers. The conduits pulsed in rhythm, and for the first time, the dormant core gave off a low vibration. Monitors in the observation deck lit up with streams of unreadable alien script. Technicians scrambled. It's coming online," one of them stammered. Colonel Harris stormed into the hangar, barking orders. "Stabilize readings! Get me containment protocols now!" Ethan slid out from under the panel, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Told you she was just blocked." The scientists stared, mouths half open. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not from a grease monkey with a toolbox older than some of their laptops. Zalara appeared above on the balcony, her robes gleaming under the lights. She didn't smirk this time. She simply stared, her expression unreadable. Harris marched over to Ethan. "What did you do?" Ethan shrugged. "Listened? Shifted some connections, let the core breathe. You are all treating it like a machine. It's more like a stubborn mule. Kick it too hard and it'll just dig in its heels." The colonel's jaw clenched. "Don't get clever with me. Do you realize what you've just done? That ship has been dormant for weeks. If you woke it too quickly, you could have triggered—" A deep thrum cut him off. The floor vibrated beneath their boots. The starship's core flared with light. Bright enough to make the guards shield their eyes, systems began rebooting in cascading waves, lights sweeping across the vessel like a heartbeat. Ethan stepped back, awe spreading across his face. "Well, would you look at that?" The room exploded into chaos. Scientists shouted, alarms blared, soldiers raised weapons as though the ship itself were about to attack. Zalara descended from the balcony with calm, deliberate steps. She approached the ship, one hand brushing across its surface. The vessel responded instantly, glowing brighter where her palm touched. Her lips curved faintly. She breathes again. Ethan grinned. "Guess I passed your little test." The Queen turned her gaze on him. For a moment, there was no mockery in her eyes, only acknowledgement. "Perhaps you did." But not everyone was celebrating. Later that night, Ethan was summoned to a private debrief with Harris and a pair of intelligence officers. The room was small, lined with humming monitors, the kind of place where secrets lived. One of the officers, a sharp-eyed woman with a clipped tone, folded her arms. "Rourke, you're either the luckiest man alive or you know more than you're admitting. Which is it?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I know machines." "That's it." Harris slammed a folder on the table. "Don't play games. Our best people couldn't do what you just did. Are you feeding information to them?" "Them?" Ethan frowned. "The aliens," the woman cut in. "You've been seen speaking with the Queen. At night, alone. What exactly are you discussing?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "You think I'm a spy now? I'm busting my back fixing your problem while you accuse me of treason?" The officer leaned closer. "We're not accusing. We're asking. Loyalty matters here. If you're compromised—" "Compromised?" Ethan snapped. "I wouldn't be crawling under that monster if I was compromised. I'd be running for the hills." The room fell silent. Harris studied him, expression unreadable. Finally, he growled, Keep working. But understand this. If we even smell betrayal, you'll disappear into a cell so deep, no one will remember your name. Ethan stood, shoving the chair back. Then you'd better pray I don't quit because I'm the only thing standing between you and a dead ship. When he stormed out, his pulse hammered. He wasn't afraid of Harris. What rattled him was the realization that his success had made him a target. To the government, he was both an asset and a liability. To Zalira, he was still a curiosity. And to himself, he was starting to wonder what he'd gotten dragged into. That night, back in the hangar, Zalira approached him again. He didn't stop working, just muttered, "Your little joke's getting me accused of treason." Her voice was cool. "Your people fear what they cannot control. It is their nature." He looked at her, eyes weary but sharp. "And you? You mocking me that first day? Was that your nature or just arrogance?" For once, she didn't smirk. She stepped closer, her gaze steady. It was disbelief. And perhaps a mistake. Ethan blinked, taken off guard. She had never admitted fault before. Before he could answer, alarms blared again, but not from the ship this time. Guards sprinted across the hangar. A technician shouted about unauthorized access near the core. Someone had tried to sabotage the systems Ethan had just restored. Ethan and Zalira locked eyes, both realizing the same thing. Fixing the ship wasn't the only challenge. Someone wanted it to stay broken. But sabotage changes the game, and soon Ethan would learn that repairing engines was far simpler than repairing trust. The alarms wailed through the facility, red lights flashing against concrete walls as guards flooded the hangar. Ethan stood frozen for a second, wrench still in his hand, staring at the chaos unraveling around him. Soldiers shouted, technicians scrambled to shut down panels, and Queen Zalira remained perfectly still, her silver robes glinting under the emergency strobes. "Lock it down!" Colonel Harris roared, his voice echoing over the noise. "No one in or out until we find who did this!" Ethan shoved his wrench into his pocket and jogged toward the nearest console. One of the technicians was pale, trembling as lines of alien script raced across the monitor. "What happened?" Ethan demanded. The young man stammered. Someone triggered a surge in the containment systems. If you hadn't stabilized the core earlier, it could have detonated." Ethan's throat went dry. He glanced up at the massive ship, its conduits still glowing faintly. "So someone was trying to fry the whole place." Harris stormed over, jabbing a finger at Ethan. "You were the last one in here before the breach. What did you touch?" Ethan snapped back. "Don't start with me. I was the one who saved it from blowing. Your security's the problem, not my wrench." The accusation hung heavy in the air until Zalira's voice sliced through. Calm, cold, unflinching. "Your enemy is not the mechanic. It is the coward hiding among you." Everyone fell silent. Zalira's gaze swept the hangar like a blade, and for the first time, Ethan noticed how the guards avoided meeting her eyes. She carried an authority that transcended uniform or title. Harris scowled but barked orders for a full sweep of the facility. Hours later, after the alarms finally died, Ethan sat on a crate in the corner of the hangar. His hands were filthy, his mind spinning. He'd signed up to fix engines, not get tangled in sabotage, politics, and accusations of treason. He glanced up when he sensed movement. Zalira approached, silent as always, her expression unreadable. "Why is it," Ethan muttered, "that every time things blow up, literally or otherwise, you're standing right there, calm as a stone?" "Because panic solves nothing," she replied. She stopped a few feet away, studying him. "Someone wants my vessel destroyed. Perhaps it is your government, perhaps it is mine." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "So you're saying I'm fixing an engine caught in the middle of a war I don't understand?" Her lips curved faintly. "Now you begin to see." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You think it was one of your people?" Her silence was telling. She didn't want to admit it. but he could read it in her eyes. "You've got enemies on both sides," he said. "Hell of a place to park a starship." For the first time, she sat across from him, folding her long limbs gracefully. Without guards, without ceremony, she almost looked human. "When I mocked you, I believed you insignificant. But you keep surviving storms that should drown you. Perhaps that is why they fear you." Ethan gave a dry laugh. "Trust me, lady, I'm not worth fearing." Her gaze sharpened. "Do not mistake humility for truth. You touch what no one else can. That frightens them more than you realize." Their conversation was cut short by Harris storming back in, a tablet clutched in his hand. He tossed it onto the crate beside Ethan. Grainy security footage flickered on the screen, someone in a hooded uniform sneaking near the propulsion core with a device in hand. "Caught the saboteur," Harris growled. "One of ours. Technician named Roland Keats. He's in custody now." Ethan squinted at the screen. The figure planted something near the conduits, but before the act could finish, the core flared with the same light Ethan had coaxed from it earlier. The surge knocked Roland flat before he was dragged off camera by guards. "So the ship defended itself," Ethan muttered. Zalara's eyes gleamed. "She protects what is hers." Harris shot them both a warning glare. "Don't romanticize this thing. We'll interrogate Keats. Meanwhile, Rourke, you stay on task. That ship isn't going anywhere until I say so." When Harris left, Ethan exhaled. "You hear that tone? He doesn't trust me either. Feels like I'm one bad move away from being locked in the same cell." Zalira tilted her head, her voice softer now. "Then you must choose carefully who you stand with." Ethan leaned back against the wall, staring up at the alien vessel glowing faintly above them. For the first time, he wondered if fixing it wasn't just about mechanics anymore. It was about survival and not just his. But survival has a price, and soon Ethan would realize that every wrench he turned pulled him deeper into a war of loyalty and betrayal. By the 10th day, the hangar buzzed with restless energy. Guards rotated in tense silence. Scientists whispered nervously over readouts they barely understood, and Ethan's every move was tracked by watchful eyes. The sabotage had rattled everyone. But for Ethan, the focus hadn't changed. Get the ship running. He stood on a scaffold halfway up the vessel's side, hands blackened with grease and streaked with glowing dust from the conduits. Below, a cluster of officials muttered anxiously, waiting for either a triumph or a disaster. "All right," Ethan murmured, tightening one last connection. "Time to see if you're ready to stretch your legs again." He inserted the core fragment Zalira had given him days earlier, slotting it into a cradle of crystal veins. The moment it clicked into place, the ship shuddered. A low, resonant hum rolled through the hangar, rattling bolts loose from the scaffolding. Lights flared across the hull in rapid succession, each one brighter than the last. Technicians cried out as monitors spiked. "Energy output climbing exponentially. Stabilizers holding at 60%, another shouted. Colonel Harris barked over the comms. "Shut it down if it passes 80. We're not risking another surge." But Ethan ignored him. He pressed his hand flat against the panel, whispering like he had all week. "Come on, don't fight me now. Show them what you can do." The core pulsed once, then twice, before bursting with a surge of light that blinded everyone in the room. When the glare faded, the starship stood glowing as if reborn, every system alive and thrumming with power. The floor shook as the propulsion engines cycled for the first time in weeks. Silence followed. Then the room erupted. Scientists shouted, soldiers reached for weapons, alarms blared from control panels. But above the chaos, one sound cut through, a laugh. Ethan's laugh, rough and disbelieving. "Well, would you look at that?" he muttered. "She's alive." Zalira stepped forward from the shadows of the hangar, her expression unreadable. She approached the ship, her hand grazing the surface. The vessel responded immediately, glowing brighter beneath her touch. She turned to Ethan, her voice carrying through the pandemonium. "You have done what my people believed impossible." Ethan smirked, wiping sweat from his brow. Guess you'll have to find a new way to mock me." The Queen studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Perhaps I underestimated more than just your skill." Before he could answer, Harris stormed up the scaffold ladder, fury etched across his face. "You ignored a direct order, Rourke. Do you have any idea what could have happened if that surge went critical?" Ethan looked down at him calmly. "Yeah, it could have failed. Instead, it worked. You wanted results, Colonel. There they are." Harris's glare could have burned holes in steel. "One more stunt like that, and you're finished. Do you understand me?" Ethan held his gaze. Crystal clear. The confrontation left the air heavy. Soldiers whispered about the mechanic defying military command, while scientists debated whether the ship's systems were stable or merely dormant before. Yet amid the noise, Zalara's eyes stayed fixed on Ethan. That night, long after the hangar emptied, Ethan sat on a crate with his tools scattered around him. His body ached, his mind buzzed with exhaustion, but a small, undeniable spark of pride burned in his chest. He had done it. Zalara appeared quietly, as she always did. She studied him in silence for a moment before saying, "In my world, when one achieves the impossible, it is customary to receive honor. What do you humans call it? Respect?" Ethan chuckled. "Respect works." "Then you have mine," she said softly. The words caught him off guard. For all her sharp wit and regal arrogance, she'd never spoken to him without an edge before. "Well," he said, scratching the back of his neck, "guess that's worth more than a paycheck." She tilted her head. "Do not belittle it. Few earn my respect. Fewer still hold it." For the first time, Ethan realized her smirk had faded. She wasn't mocking him anymore. She was looking at him with something closer to recognition. Still, the rumors swirled. By morning, the entire base whispered about the Queen's marriage promise again. Only this time, they weren't laughing. Some claimed it was a binding vow in her culture, others said it was still just a joke. But the seed of possibility had been planted. And as Ethan leaned against the hull, staring at the glowing veins of alien light, he wondered which was more dangerous, proving himself to humans who didn't trust him, or to an alien queen who suddenly might. But proving yourself once means they'll expect it again, and the next test would demand more than tools and stubbornness. It would demand a choice. The hangar was quieter after the breakthrough, but it wasn't peace. It was anticipation. Everyone seemed to move differently now. Guards watched Ethan more closely. Scientists whispered about him with a mix of awe and jealousy, and Harris kept him under constant surveillance. Still, the real change wasn't in the humans. It was in Zalira. She no longer stayed on the balcony, looking down on him with detached amusement. She walked the hangar floor, closer to him, watching the way he worked with a focus that carried none of the earlier mockery. Ethan noticed. He wasn't used to being observed like a specimen, but there was something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite name, that made him tolerate it. One evening, when most of the staff had retired to their quarters, Ethan was hunched over the propulsion system, sweat dripping into his eyes. He heard her voice behind him, softer than usual. "You push yourself beyond reason." He wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve. "Engines don't fix themselves." "Thought you'd appreciate that." "I appreciate results," she replied, stepping closer. "But even machines burn out. You are flesh. You will fail if you do not rest." Ethan gave a short laugh. "Been failing my whole life, Queen." "Doesn't stop me from getting back up." Her gaze lingered on him. "Why do you mock your own struggle?" "Because if you don't laugh at yourself, someone else will," Ethan said, tightening a bolt. "Guess you proved that on day one." For a brief moment, her lips curved. Not the sharp smirk he knew so well, but something gentler. "And yet, you did not bend. That is rare." The silence stretched between them. Ethan leaned against the ship, looking at her directly. "You really meant it, didn't you? When you said, 'Fix this and I'll marry you.'" Her expression shifted, the faintest flicker of surprise. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her tone was deliberate. "Among my people, words carry weight. I spoke in jest, but jest can still bind. Ethan shook his head. Well, I'm not the marrying type. I can barely keep a truck running long enough to pay the bills, let alone run off with an alien queen. Do not flatter yourself, she said quickly, though her voice lacked its usual sting. Marriage was not the promise. Proof was. You have shown it. That is what matters. Still, Ethan could feel it. The shift. Whatever had begun as mockery was now something else. Respect, maybe? Curiosity? Or the spark of something even stranger. The next morning, the rumors reached new heights. 2 soldiers gossiping near the cafeteria claimed they'd overheard Zalera asking about human marriage customs. A scientist swore she'd seen Ethan and the Queen speaking in hushed tones at midnight. By lunchtime, the base was buzzing with speculation. Ethan tried to ignore it, but when he walked back into the hangar, Harris cornered him. You need to be careful, Harris said low, his eyes sharp. Half this base thinks you're in her pocket. The other half thinks you're sleeping with her. Either way, it makes you dangerous. Ethan bristled. I didn't ask for her attention. I just fix what's broken. Doesn't matter, Harris pressed. Perception is power. And right now, you've got more of it than is safe. Ethan shoved past him. Then maybe you should be more worried about why your people couldn't fix this thing in the first place. That night, Ethan sat on the scaffold again, staring at the glowing conduits. His hands rested on the railing, but his mind was far away. He thought about the Queen's eyes, about the way her tone softened when she spoke of respect. He thought about the weight of words, about promises made in jest but carried like chains. Footsteps echoed below. Zalera approached, stopping at the base of the scaffold. You are troubled. Ethan looked down at her. Everyone here thinks I'm either your puppet or your whatever. I don't even know what they want me to be. And what do you want to be? She asked. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, just a man who fixes engines. Nothing more. She tilted her head, her gaze piercing. And yet, you are already more. You proved what others could not. That cannot be undone. Ethan exhaled, leaning back. Doesn't mean I'm comfortable with it. Her eyes held his. Comfort is not the measure of worth. What you endure shapes you more than what you choose. For the first time, Ethan felt the distance between them shrinking, not in steps, but in something less tangible. He wasn't just the mechanic anymore, and she wasn't just the mocking queen. Somewhere in the tension of the hangar, a bond had begun to take root. But bonds, once formed, demand choices, and soon Ethan would face one that no amount of grease or grit could prepare him for. The following days blurred together. Ethan barely slept, catching scraps of rest on a cot tucked in the corner of the hangar. His tools never left his side, and neither did the weight of suspicion pressing down on him. Every time he passed a hallway, whispers followed. Every time he ate, he felt eyes boring into him. The government no longer saw him as just a mechanic. He was becoming a variable they couldn't control, and that made him dangerous. On the 12th night, Colonel Harris summoned him to a closed-door meeting. The room was small, stripped bare of everything except a table, 2 chairs, and a stack of files. Harris leaned forward, hands clasped, his voice low. Rourke, you've done something no one else could. That makes you an asset, but it also means we can't have you playing both sides. Ethan frowned. Both sides? I've been fixing your problem. That's it. Don't play dumb, Harris snapped. You spend every night speaking with her. People are talking. The higher-ups want answers. Ethan's jaw tightened. She's the only one who knows how the ship's supposed to function. If you'd stop treating her like a prisoner, maybe you'd see that. Harris slammed a hand against the table. She is a prisoner. Don't forget where your loyalty lies. Ethan leaned back, folding his arms. My loyalty lies with fixing what's broken. That includes your busted ship and your busted way of thinking. The colonel's face darkened. You keep walking this line, Rourke, and you'll find yourself on the wrong side of it. When Ethan left the room, his chest was tight. He wasn't just patching up conduits anymore. He was patching up trust that frayed with every passing day. And he was starting to realize he couldn't hold both ends of the rope forever. Later that evening, as he worked under the starship's wing, Zalira approached quietly. She studied him in silence before finally asking, "What did your colonel say to you?" Ethan sighed. "Same thing he's been saying since I got here, that I can't trust you. That I've got to pick a side." Her expression sharpened. "And will you?" He looked up at her, meeting her gaze. "I'm not built for politics. I fix things. But you and him, you're pulling me into something bigger than I signed up for." Zalira stepped closer, her eyes steady. "Do you think you can stand in the middle forever? The storm will tear you apart if you do." Her words hung heavy. Ethan set his wrench down and rubbed his temples. "So what, I'm supposed to betray my own people? Or betray you? Either way, I lose." She tilted her head, silver garments shimmering faintly in the ship's glow. "Not betrayal. Choice. There is a difference." For the first time, Ethan let the silence stretch between them. He thought about the way Harris looked at him, with suspicion, as though waiting for him to slip. He thought about the way the Queen looked at him, with something more complicated, harder to name. Finally, he said, "Back home, I once spent 3 weeks fixing an engine nobody thought could run again. Everyone said it was dead weight, a waste of time, but when it roared back to life, the owner looked at me like I'd performed a miracle. Truth is, it wasn't a miracle. It was just care. Machines respond to care. People should too." Her gaze softened. "You believe care is enough to mend broken worlds?" Ethan smirked tiredly. "I believe it's the only place to start." That night, the bond between them deepened, not with declarations, but with an unspoken recognition. They were both trapped in a storm of mistrust, both forced to prove themselves to people who doubted them. By morning, the rumors had spiraled further. Soldiers speculated that Ethan was already compromised, that Zalira had bound him with some alien oath. Others claimed he was her chosen consort, destined to leave Earth with her once the ship was fully restored. Harris fueled the paranoia by doubling patrols and ordering background checks on Ethan's entire life. But Ethan ignored the noise. He focused on the ship because that was something he could control. And as the propulsion core glowed brighter each day, he knew he was inching closer to a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But once the ship was ready, Ethan wouldn't just be asked to prove his skill, he'd be forced to prove his loyalty, and that decision would change everything. The final test came on the 15th day. The ship was ready. Every conduit glowed steady. Every system hummed with power, and the propulsion core pulsed like a living heart. Ethan stood in the center of the hangar, grease-stained as always, surrounded by soldiers with weapons drawn and scientists staring at monitors they barely understood. Colonel Harris barked orders into radios, but all eyes were on the Queen and the mechanic. Zalira approached the vessel, her silver garments trailing behind her like liquid metal. She pressed her hand against the hull, and the ship responded instantly, a surge of light racing across its frame. She turned to Ethan. "It awaits your touch." Ethan climbed the scaffold one last time, every step echoing in his chest. He reached the control node, fingers brushing the panel. He didn't think about sabotage, or rumors, or Harris breathing down his neck. He just thought about the machine, the wounded beast he'd nursed back to health. "All right," he whispered, "let's see if you can fly." The propulsion system roared to life, a sound that rattled the hangar but didn't break it. Flames licked the air as thrusters ignited, steady and controlled. The entire ship lifted inches off the ground, hovering like a leviathan waking from slumber. Gasps filled the room. Guards tightened their grips on their rifles. Scientists scrambled to record data, and Harris shouted for calm. Ethan grinned despite himself. "She's flying." Zalira's eyes shone with something deeper than victory. She stepped closer to the ship, then turned her gaze to Ethan. "You have done what I thought no human could." You gave life back to what was lost." Before Ethan could answer, Harris cut in, his voice sharp as a blade. "Shut it down." Now Ethan frowned. "What? It's stable. You heard me," Harris snapped. "Deactivate it before this turns into an international incident." Zalira's gaze hardened. "He will not. This vessel belongs to my people. It was promised." The standoff froze the hangar. Soldiers raised weapons. Alien attendants tensed, hands hovering over their strange devices. And Ethan stood in the middle, the mechanic no one had trusted, now holding the balance between two worlds. He looked from Harris to Zalira. "You both keep treating this ship like it's a weapon. But it's not. It's a lifeline. And right now, it doesn't belong to governments or crowns. It belongs to trust." "Trust?" Harris spat. "You're a fool if you think she won't use this against us." "And you're a fool," Ethan shot back, "if you think destroying it makes you any safer. Fear isn't a strategy. It's a noose." The hangar went still. Even the ship seemed to quiet under his words. Zalira stepped closer, her voice low but clear. "You speak truth, mechanic. You are not bound by fear. That is why you succeeded." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then slowly, Ethan pressed the control node, lowering the ship back to the hangar floor. The thrusters dimmed, the glow softened, and silence returned, Hod. The Queen's eyes locked on him. "You could have chosen him." She gestured to Harris. "Yet you chose balance." "That is rare." Ethan wiped sweat from his brow. "I didn't choose sides. I chose what was right. Fix what's broken, don't make it worse. That's all I know." The lesson hung heavy in the air, one even Harris couldn't dismiss. He didn't like it. Ethan could see that in his clenched jaw, but he didn't argue, not this time. Later, as the hangar emptied, Zalira approached him alone. Her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. "Among my people, respect is earned through trials. You have earned more than respect." Ethan gave a tired smile. "Don't tell me you're still serious about that marriage offer." For the first time, she laughed. Not sharp, not mocking, but warm. "Perhaps in another life. For now, you have already bound yourself. To purpose, to courage, to truth. That is enough." He nodded, his chest heavy with exhaustion but lightened by her words. "Then I'll take that over any crown." The story of Ethan Rourke didn't end with a wedding or a throne. It ended with a lesson carved deep into every witness who saw him do the impossible. That greatness doesn't always wear a uniform or a crown. Sometimes it wears oil-stained gloves and carries a battered toolbox. And if there's one thing to take away from his story, it's this. You don't have to be royalty or a genius to change the world. You just have to be willing to care enough to fix what others have given up on. So if you followed Ethan's journey this far, take the lesson with you. Fix what's broken in your own life. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next.